You know, when we think about the plant world, we often picture something, well, pretty static, right? But underneath all that quiet green, there's this constant high-stakes drama of attraction, competition, and reproduction. I mean, plants, just like animals, have to pass on their genes, but they have to do it without ever moving an inch. So let's dive into this surprisingly complex world.
Right? This is the fundamental puzzle, and it's a puzzle that has driven the evolution of this incredible diversity of reproductive strategies. Plants have come up with solutions that are way more complex, more competitive, and honestly just more clever than you could possibly imagine.
So here's what we're going to cover. First, we'll get into why plant sex is so complicated in the first place. Then we'll break down the huge choice every plant faces. Should I self-fertilize or cross-pollinate with someone else? We'll run a little cost-benefit analysis on that, check out some of nature's really clever solutions, and finally, we'll explore the massive ripple effects these choices have on, well, everything.
All right, so let's set the stage. Being literally rooted in one spot, that presents some pretty serious challenges when it comes to making the next generation.
So plants have two main options. They can go the asexual route, basically making perfect little clones of themselves, or they can reproduce sexually, which means mixing their genes with another individual by fusing their reproductive cells, their gametes. And it's in this world of sexual reproduction that things get really fascinating, because it forces plants to solve that core problem of finding a mate.
And that leads us to the next big question. See, the vast majority of plants are hermaphroditic. They have both male and female parts in one flower. So for them, the choice isn't just if they'll reproduce, but with whom. And that boils down to two main strategies. On one hand, you've got self-fertilization, or selfing. This is basically the ultimate form of inbreeding. On the other hand, there's outcrossing, mating with a completely different, unrelated plant. And this one decision, it shapes so much of a plant's entire biology.
And you can really see the results of that choice right here. On the left is Arabidopsis thaliana, a classic self-pollinator. On the right, that's its close cousin Arabidopsis lyrata, which absolutely has to outcross. Now, even though they're closely related, their mating strategy has sent them down totally different evolutionary paths. The outcrosser, for instance, has way more genetic variation, which can affect everything from how big its flowers are to how well it fights off disease.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. You might think inbreeding is always a bad idea, right? But look at this. Nearly half of all flowering plants do it. So that begs the question, if outcrossing is so great for creating healthy genetic diversity, why on earth is selfing so incredibly common?
To answer that, you kind of have to think like an evolutionary accountant. You have to weigh the pros and cons of this massive decision.
Okay, let's start with the huge immediate benefit of selfing. The brilliant biologist R.A. Fisher figured this out. A gene that causes a plant to self-fertilize gets a massive head start. Why? Because the parent passes its genes to its own offspring through both its pollen, the male part, and its ovules, the female part. An outcrosser only gets to contribute half the genes. This gives selfing a whopping 50% genetic advantage right out of the gate.
The second major advantage is just plain practical. It's what we call reproductive assurance. Think about it. If you're a single plant that's just colonized a new island, or maybe the bees just aren't showing up this year, selfing is your safety net. You're guaranteed to reproduce. You don't need a partner. This idea is called Baker's Law, and it perfectly explains why these self-sufficient plants can be such successful pioneers.
But, and it's a huge but, there's a massive trade-off: inbreeding depression. This is the big downside. Selfing dramatically increases the chances that two nasty, harmful recessive mutations will meet up in an offspring, which leads to weaker, less fertile plants. This is the main evolutionary force that's constantly pushing back against self-fertilization.
So here's the scoreboard. In the pros column for selfing, you have that huge 50% gene transmission advantage, and you've got guaranteed reproduction. But in the cons column, you've got inbreeding depression, less genetic diversity overall, and a weaker ability for the whole population to adapt to future challenges. It is a classic evolutionary tug-of-war.
And it all comes down to this number: 0.5. For outcrossing to actually be the better strategy, the cost of inbreeding depression has to, well, enormous. It has to slash the fitness of the offspring by more than 50% just to cancel out that automatic genetic head start that selfing gets. That's a really high bar to clear.
So given that high bar, the fact that so many plants do manage to outcross tells you they must have evolved some pretty incredible tricks to make sure they don't pollinate themselves. Let's take a look at their arsenal.
First up, origami. This is just a simple, elegant architectural solution. The flower is physically built in a way that keeps the male parts, the anthers, far away from the female parts, the stigmas. It's like designing a room to keep two people from accidentally bumping into each other.
Next, we have dichogamy. The idea here is if you can't separate them in space, just separate them in time. In these plants, the male parts mature and release their pollen at a completely different time than when the female parts are ready to receive it. It's all about timing to avoid self-pollination.
And maybe the most sophisticated solution of all is self-incompatibility. This is purely genetic. The plant can actually recognize its own pollen and actively reject it. It's like a biochemical security system, a lock-in key that makes sure only pollen from a totally unrelated plant can get the job done.
But here's the thing. This fundamental choice between selfing and outcrossing, it doesn't just affect a plant's sex life. It has these profound cascading effects on how that plant interacts with its entire environment.
This is truly wild. Recent research has uncovered this incredibly powerful link between a plant's mating system and how it defends itself from getting eaten. That choice, to self or to outcross, can actually predict its entire defense philosophy.
Just look at this. In the nightshade family, the outcrossing species, shown here in green, they tend to invest a ton of energy into defenses that are always on. They are constantly armed and ready for an attack. But the inbreeding species, in blue, they take a totally different approach. They evolve what's called an inducible defense. They only switch on their chemical weapons after they've been attacked. It suggests that outcrossers are playing the long, safe game, while selfers are conserving energy and living a little more on the edge. And this, of course, brings us to the modern world. Our own activities, things like chopping up habitats and disrupting pollinator populations, are putting a massive thumb on the evolutionary scale. We are, unintentionally, pushing tons of plant populations away from outcrossing and towards selfing. This graph from a major study shows it perfectly. Every dot is a plant species. The horizontal axis is its outcrossing rate in a natural habitat. The vertical axis is its rate in a disturbed one. The fact that nearly all the dots fall below that diagonal line tells a really stark story. Human disturbance consistently forces plants to self-pollinate more.
So this leaves us with a really critical question. As we mess with their environments, we're seeing plants shift towards selfing because, hey, it guarantees they can reproduce in the short term. But is this a brilliant adaptation for survival, or is it an evolutionary trap? By sacrificing that precious genetic diversity for a short-term guarantee, these species might be trading away their ability to adapt in the long run, basically painting themselves into an evolutionary corner. And that's a question that botanists and ecologists are racing to answer right now.